The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Today's episode is presented by PBS Charlotte's Unspun program, helping you learn what politicians are thinking but not saying, hosted by former Governor Pat McCrory. Welcome to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. I'm Ashley Fay, managing editor of the Charlotte Ledger. To find out more about the Charlotte Ledger, visit thecharlotteledger.com. I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Cooper, president and CEO of the Levine Museum of the New South. Today, we're talking about the Levine Museum's upcoming move to South End, what goes into planning out a history museum in the 21st century, and how the Levine Museum fits into Charlotte's growth story. Thanks for joining us today. Can you first start by telling me about the process the Levine Museum undertook to look for a new facility in Charlotte?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we came in and looked at over 35 different locations, there were multiple pillars. We worked with the different kind of architects on our grid as we went through that process. We were looking at where we could build a permanent home, right? So 7th Street was great. It was not built for a museum. So could there be a space where we could actually build a museum on that property? Is there a space that's still in the light rail and accessible, right? Is it in a space that has foot traffic, opportunities for engagement? Does it connect to our mission, right? Is there a way that adds to the ability for us to deliver our impact in the community? All those, we went through a selection process of over 35 different locations across Charlotte, and all the elements landed in the South End. It has a historical connection with faith and religion. It connects the East and the West. It's right on the light rail, the walkability there, the growth of the South End over the next 30 years. There's so many reasons why we can say, hey, this is great of a location. So we're excited about going to South End. We're beginning to have conversations. We're beginning to get involved in festivals there. So we think that this is going to be an incredible opportunity for the community and for the South End.
Was it challenging to find a site in South End? You see so much development there, and there's so much interest still, even with a kind of a slowdown in the market right now. How was that trying to lock down a site in South End?
Every location we looked at was tough to look at, right? There were pros and cons of every site we looked at through this process. The South End, when we first started looking at this, we were looking at multiple locations. We were sitting here in Uptown, and there was a group of us, and we were just going back and forth. And, this Grace Covenant Church, which we purchased at 1800 South Boulevard, was actually no longer on the market. It was for a number of years. And when we reached out to the church elders about the possibility, they got excited too, because the opportunity to preserve the church, the opportunities for this to become a museum, and the story that could relate to it. So, it was definitely difficult, but, as we got to know the church elders more and talking with multiple different partners like Cindy Center Partners, Foundation of the Carolinas, a lot of our key stakeholders, the excitement just continued to grow around this site.
Great. And you guys have obviously now had a permanent home for a minute here. So how have you been able to stay engaged with folks and get people excited about either the future facility or some of the programming that maybe you're still trying to offer even without having a permanent home?
Absolutely. When we closed down the old building, we were engaging with about 70,000 people, both online and in person. Now we're engaging with over 320,000 people. We've done that in multiple different ways. We've partnered with the incredible library system here. They do an incredible amount of work, so we've done a lot of programs with them, from author talks to dialogues to early learning for our Young Historians program. We worked with breweries across, we've worked with other community partners and business leaders on, up and down Tryon Street to host like our MLK Day celebration. So in many ways, it allowed for us to think outside the box, being out of a home, right? And we learned a lot through that process. We've launched stuff online where teachers can fully engage. We created a podcast. Those have driven our conversation, not just here in Charlotte and the South, but really globally. We're closely getting ready to surpass over 1 million downloads on our podcast, which is incredible to see that.
As someone who has a podcast, that is impressive.
Yeah, so we're very excited about that. But I think that the key thing is what we learned in all of that is the community remains excited, and as we continue to give little snippets of the updates of, hey, we're looking at locations, here's some of the things we're looking at. As we had these community conversations and we listened to those moments, it became more important for us to to kind of move towards the permanent home in the announcement. Some of this you probably, as you get deeper into a capital campaign, is when you would show. But the community was so excited. We felt that, showing more of what we're hoping to do and building more community impact around this was important at this moment.
Yeah, we actually heard from a few readers after the initial news came out about the site's history, but I'd love to hear about how that played into the decision to relocate the Levine Museum here and how you guys maybe plan to continue to either honor that history or make sure it stays preserved.
Absolutely. So we've always, even in our old 7th Street building, talked about the history of Billy Graham and faith and religion, so that's a major influencer of the New South story. So logically, it made very sense to us to have a space like this. I think also having historic structure as potentially part of the experience also added to how our mission is to connect the past to the present, and having a historic building with modern building as we work through that process and what that looks like, it just made the story a lot more interesting to us.
Okay, great. So walk me through sort of the next milestones, the next process. I know you're doing a lot of community engagement right now, trying to figure out what this is going to maybe look like or what you're going to offer here. So how has that been going?
It's been going great. So we have been hosting a lot of conversations with the community, which we've done over the last 3 years to get us to this point. Just last month, we had about 200 different community members from all across Charlotte, both business leaders, just individual people that have engaged with the museum, a lot of new folks that want to learn more about the museum that we've engaged with over the last couple of years as part of this process. So we had about 200 of them here, and we had like a science fair where we were asking all kinds of really cool questions about what do they hope to get out of a home, of a new place? What did they love about the old place? What stories would they like us to tell? I think some of the other things that we learned is how over the last couple of years, how the intergenerational elements play into this. How are families coming to spaces like this? So we've done a lot of work with families. We have upcoming days where we'll be across the city and we'll be bringing found objects from around the Carolinas, like sticks and shells and all kinds of other really cool stuff. And we're going to ask kids questions like, where do you feel most at home? Where do you feel loved, or things like that, and allow them to create, which that's actually all that information is going to go into. Our goal is to create an amazing new experience, interactive experience for young families to engage in our new space.
Has anything surprising come out so far in the engagement process as far as what people want to see or how they maybe perceive the Levine Museum that you guys are thinking differently about your program?
We've learned a whole bunch of different stuff. Some of the stuff that we've learned is about, the love for our collection and the hopeful growth of our collection. We've learned about the power of place, right? And what that church means here to Charlotte. We've learned about, different stories that have come up that people are coming in and sharing. The greatest thing for me is when someone comes in and says, hey, I was in a picture in your old galleries, or my mom or my dad or my grandparents. So that love for the museum definitely has come out stronger and stronger, and that how hopeful people are that this is coming back.
So what's left as far as, I know you're going to continue to talk with the community. There's, I'm sure, a lot more kind of listening and engagement to come, but what does kind of that look like over the next few months?
Perfect. So we are going to be, over the next couple of months, launching a number of community sessions that we'll continue to collect. We'll be continuing to bring the architects back as an iterative process with the community, sharing, collecting feedback. We'll also begin to have vision experiences where we will have themes that could potentially go into the new building, where we will create into an exhibition that people from all across the South will get to come and engage with this, leave feedback, add stories, add oral histories to it, and we'll collect that over the next year, and that will actually inform the first major exhibition that will go into the museum. So this is all about how do we connect a history museum with community hub? Mm-hmm. How do those two things intersect? Mm-hmm. And you can't do that without collecting all this from the community.
Sure. So you're going to go from where you guys had been for a long time on 7th Street to the temporary space to what seems like a much bigger space. What are you kind of most excited about as far as what you'll be able to offer as far as new offerings or expanding current exhibits? What are some of the things you're most looking forward to in the new facility?
So, obviously I'm a historian. I'm a scholar. I can't wait to build, incredible new exhibitions. In the old space, we had an incredible exhibition, but it had been around for 30 years. This is what we're going to be able to do in this space is to update more often the experiences as we bring in new pieces. We're going to have incredible spaces where we'll be able to bring in artifacts from all around the South and around the nation that reflect our stories. As I've talked about the intergenerational piece and how we're getting families engaged, we're going to create spaces where the youngest audiences can come and engage in this. But we also have learned a lot over the last several years of how children learn and how they understand these stories starting as early as 3. So we're going to start to embark on a new incredible journey so families can become part of the story.
Great. And how is technology going to play a role? I'm sure it is. It looks like a very modern museum, and technology is kind of touching our lives in every way. Is there any thoughts yet on how that may be incorporated in the museum?
So technology will definitely be incorporated throughout. That we're starting to work with exhibit firms about what that will actually look like. So I don't want to say it will exactly be this, but I will say, we will definitely use different forms of technology that could include AI, that includes, virtual reality, that includes image mapping. There's all kinds of ways we will look to use technology in this space, but that we're still early in those conversations.
We'll be right back to the conversation. Today's episode is presented by PBS Charlotte's Unspun program, discussing what politicians are thinking but not saying. So once you kind of get through the community engagement, which I know is going to be an ongoing process, what are some of the other milestones you have to hit as far as the campaign or getting kind of your ducks in a row, so to speak, to make sure you can put a shovel on the ground?
No, absolutely. I mean, we're in the middle of, beginning conversations with the community. We've been having those over the last 2 years leading up to this point. Obviously, getting the funds to make this happen are incredibly important. We're having great conversations. We're continuing on the right path there. We're leveraging, we're an investor in our capital campaign. We're leveraging dollars that we had from selling the old property to help also lift this experience up in the work that we're doing. So those conversations will continue. We'll have, exhibit firms that will come in and architects that will come in and continue that iterative process with the community. That'll be a big piece of this. The other piece is we're going to activate 1800 South Boulevard, where people will get to come and see vision rooms and experience kind of what we're creating and provide feedback there. We'll do lectures and experiences and summer camps on site until shovels go in the ground.
Okay, cool. So you plan to do some activation even before this big new building is built?
Absolutely. I was just over there today and we are cleaning up, we're painting, we're changing some things and getting it ready for activation where people will get to come on site, hopefully later this summer, early fall.
And tell me a little bit about the inspiration behind the design. I know you worked with the architecture firm kind of work that you hired to work with you guys, but it's a very modern building. What was sort of the visioning process for getting to that? I know it's a concept and maybe not exactly will look that way in reality, but what was sort of the process of getting to that look?
So we actually worked with multiple community members, across the city, and thinking about that and what they hope for. We did a design competition where we sent out to 9 architecture firms across the United States, and actually were selected Picard Chilton as our architects of design architects of record. They have, through that process, they looked at different types of modeling. It will continue to evolve. As you said, it's still conceptual, but, how we think about, the New South and the progress of the New South, but also thinking about like, how do we maintain a historical element in the story and how do those two elements blend is kind of what's led us to this point.
I'm glad you brought up the term New South, which is, of course, such a key part of your name and I'm sure your brand. I feel like that term has gotten so many meetings now in 2026. So as you guys think about the Levine Museum, whether it's this new facility or even just you all as a museum, what does New South mean for Charlotte or in 2026?
I mean, the New South, we have our New South podcast and we've had 3 seasons. I think we're 30 episodes in that we've had now. And if you go back and listen to those, you can get them on Spotify or Apple podcasts and things like that. All 30 will give you different definitions of the New South, right? For us, what we look at is, how the South continues to evolve and how it continues to, to grow and to change and transform the idea of the South, to make it, somewhat more inclusive. How do we continue to meet the needs of people here in the South? How does that reflect on the nation? So depending on who you ask, the New South is in many different ways, but for us, it's continuing to see how the South continues to become more inclusive as we move forward.
Especially we have so many people moving to Charlotte every day. They might not know what the Levine Museum of the New South is. How would you explain that to a newcomer to Charlotte, what you guys are, what you offer, what the Levine Museum is all about?
So that's a great question. We are a top history museum here in the region. We, Condé Nast, even without a building, named us the top museum in North Carolina. We've won multiple awards through our podcast. But for me, what I would say, if anybody wants to come and engage with us, is we're a space that is allowing for conversations to happen. We're trying to bring people together. We're trying to foster learning, and we're trying to allow dialogue to begin through the good stories of the South, the celebrations of the stories of the South, but also stories that have often been overlooked or are challenging. And I think that's the power of the museum.
And how does that look in this year and this time and this sort of era we're in where things feel so divisive? Maybe people aren't listening as closely as they could be. How are you guys facilitating and fostering those difficult conversations?
No, that's a great question around difficult conversations. American Alliance of Museums, which is the accrediting body of museums, they have done a ton of research across the United States and really around the world on the trust of museums. And in many ways, people rank museums and libraries still as the most trusted organizations. That's above college and universities. That's above the press. So that's a big weight to put on our shoulders. So people are coming in expecting us to use, research and data and historic record to tell stories and bring them to life. So in many ways, people are coming to museums already expecting us to have these types of real, truthful conversations that we need to have as a community. And for me, what's most exciting about museums is we have, as you said, we've lost that ability to communicate with one another, and a space where we can come together and try to create spaces where people can step into these spaces in a safe way is what's most exciting for me.
And does that, with the new facility, does that also percolate in a specific design, or how are you thinking about design and, trying to facilitate those conversations and make it, accessible to everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. So you will see in this new space, there are multiple areas where we will be able to have conversations, community gatherings, spaces where other nonprofits can come in and use our space to have, conversations that they need to be having here in the community. You'll also see our galleries will be very inviting in how they get people to step into this and feel safe to step into the conversation. As I talked about that intergenerational learning, like getting families, a space, as a family, I have a 3 and a 6-year-old. We might go to a history museum once or twice, and I love history, and I try to go to every museum, but it's still tough with 3 and 6-year-olds. So we're trying to create a space that's intergenerational, that's going to also allow kids to be kids, but also to engage with one another through, different learnings and opportunities. We'll bring in a group of people that will work with the community to create this space as we're doing with the other pieces, which will hopefully get youngest audiences engaged, which, if my kids are engaged, I'm going to get more engaged, but it also allow for, parents to come in and potentially allow their kids to stay at the museum. And then they step into a history gallery. They step into, a dialogue or a conversation. So, we're trying to really think about how does this space become active in multiple different ways, so it's not just a one-time stop, but you're coming multiple times throughout the year.
Is there programming or features that you want to include in the new facility that maybe you haven't been able to before, whether it's space constraints or other types of constraints that maybe you're excited about?
I mean, I could go in so many different ways with that. Obviously, when you build a new building, you're thinking about how do you do that, right? How do you create spaces that the old museum or a different type of museum has not had? And I think that, we're still early in that process with some of this community work. I don't want to come out and say this is what we're going to do. Again, it's coming back and listening to the community and the spaces that they hope us to create to allow these safe spaces to happen for conversation.
And, I think the museum industry probably went through kind of a reckoning, I imagine, post-pandemic. There was a time when people weren't going to museums because of health restrictions. How, whether it's Levine Museum specifically or more broadly as someone who's worked in this industry, how have you had to think differently about the role of the physical museum in sort of a post-pandemic world?
I think that continues to evolve. I think it was different for each museum. I think we learned a lot about, how we could take our pieces online, how we could, how we thought about outdoor spaces. We're thinking about this with this new space, right? How do you think about if something like this happens again in the future? Like, how do you approach that? like I said, it varies from each organization, but I think what we learn most of that people continue want to engage with the content of museums. You just have to meet them where they're at, whether that's from their living rooms, whether that's actually in person, whether that's out in the community. We will, and through all this, what we learned over the last 3 years coming out of the pandemic and the work that we've been doing transitioning into our new home is staying out in the community and meeting people where they're at. We will continue to do that. So this will really be a hub. We will continue to go to libraries. We'll continue to go to breweries. We'll continue to go to schools, right? So that doesn't change our approach. It just broadens the way we're looking at it.
Did you notice any changes in either the funding picture or things of that nature, whether it's from the pandemic or just, other reasons why funding might have dried up? And I know I hear from a lot of nonprofit leaders who say, it's been a challenging kind of environment. Is that the same for what you're facing?
I mean, funding is continuing to change. Spaces like communities, we know that museums help drive visitation. We know it helps drive hotel stays. We know that it helps get people to come into cities and spaces. We know all of that. But there are all kinds of needs out there. We had a massive disaster on the west side of the Carolinas with, the hurricane. We understand that those movements need to take place. We're continuing to have conversations with our donors and our stakeholders about what that means for us and how to also, when things like that happen, how do we step in as museums? A lot of museums across the country started to send teams out to help pack food. We did that, here. We created during COVID at a lot of museums, how do you take packages of educational resources out to schools, right? How do you open up your space for food delivery where, those couldn't happen? So, I think as museums continue to evolve, we continue to meet the community, but also not only continue to, ask for resources, but how are we actually helping the community and helping those organizations that are giving to the community meet their needs also.
And what's the reception been since you kind of went public with the plan, and either from the philanthropy community, corporate partners, or just Charlotteans?
So overall, it has been an incredible response. People are excited. I think that, there's been questions about, hey, I've never been to South End. We've heard that from some, I think, but overall, the reception of this and this announcement has been incredible. Our donors, our stakeholders continue to remain excited. Some stakeholders that we hadn't engaged with in a couple of years since we sold the building are re-engaging with us. There's so many new audiences, and people that are coming in and getting involved in this conversation. So overall, the reception's been incredible. The fun part of this is now keeping that excitement as we get shovels in the ground.
And when would you like to have a shovel in the ground, ideally?
I would say I'm not ready to say that yet, but it's sooner than later. Mm-hmm. We'll be sharing more about that here over the coming months and what that looks like. What I would say, our goal is to have this up in the early 2030s is our goal. Obviously, permitting and things like that plays into this. So, but we're pretty confident we're on the right path.
Yeah, and it's a big building, so I'm sure it will take some time to get built out, even in the interior side of things. This is my last question. It's kind of a random one, but what's a piece of the maybe New South history that you wish more people in Charlotte knew about?
Oh, so that's a great question. More than I know about. We just launched an incredible new experience online called Southern Tables, and it looks at 21 unique dishes. I think that, just the food and the cultural understanding and the different migration and immigration that is happening here in the South and how the influences that's playing on how the future of the New South will look. I think that's the most exciting thing for me right now.
Very cool. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to chat with me today.
Yes, thank you so much for the time.
That's it for today. Thanks for listening. For more information about the Charlotte Ledger, visit thecharlotteledger.com. This episode was produced by Lindsay Banks. Today's episode was presented by PBS Charlotte's Unspun program that tells you what politicians are often thinking but not saying.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.